going to begin our session on eviction. I see we've got some participants here, and before we do, I want to introduce our two speakers today. I know that Jeff is going to go first, so that you can look at him while we talk about Santra. I'm going to introduce Santra first. She's a South Florida native. She graduated from the University of Florida with a bachelor's in health and science and FIU with a master's of public health and policy and management. She's the executive director of the Miami Worker Center, a power organizing and community building organization. She has extensive experience with nonprofits, managing and developing budgets, staff leadership, oversight, writing and managing grants, building and supporting partnerships. She's developed her own activism as an anti-racist community advocate, committed to centering BIPOC community leadership and racial justice in our progressive movement. Santra is very active in her community, founding and leading an organization that builds power among Haitian American millennials, hosting radio and Facebook Live. Santra sits on many community boards, Community Advisory Board at FIU Research Center and Minority Institutions and Miami-Dade offices of New Americans. She's a New Leaders Council Fellow and a St. Love Fellow. So we're going to welcome you, Santra, such experience, and we're going to move to Jeff. And as you know, Jeff has to get off early, so he's going to start out. But Jeff Hearne is the Director of Litigation at Legal Services of Greater Miami. He oversees the firm's significant litigation, provides a strategic focus to firm's advocacy. Jeff previously served as the Advocacy Director of the Tenants' Right Unit. He's Director of the Tenants' Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law, serves on the Florida Board Civil Procedure Rules Committee, former chair of the Florida Housing Umbrella Group Statewide Association of Tenant Advocates, awards in representing tenants, including Consumer Protection Lawyer of the Year from the Florida Bar, and the Housing Justice Award from the National Housing Law Project for his successful and dynamic pursuit of housing justice for people in most need. He's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome, Jeff, and we're going to start with you and all the new information on what's happening with evictions.
Thank you for having me. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully make this work. Hopefully you can see it. Thanks for having me. So I'm the Director of Litigation at Legal Services at Greater Miami, but my background really is in tenants' rights work. That's what I love doing and have been doing for 20 years. So I always enjoy taking an opportunity to speak to people about the eviction process. So I'm going to lay out a little bit about sort of like what the law is, what's happening, because of COVID, because the law. I'm going to go over the laws in Florida, then talk about the COVID response, and then I know Sandra's going to really talk about sort of how it's impacting the people in the community that we work with, and we work with Miami Worker Center a lot, and they're doing amazing work with many of the tenants here in our community. So let me make this move along. So just want to start briefly a little bit about evictions themselves. If you haven't read the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, I would really encourage you to do so. It came out a few years ago, won the Pulitzer Prize, but it tells the story of families in Milwaukee and what it's like to deal with the lack of affordable housing and dealing with the eviction process. And it really tells their story, and their stories are the same as the stories of people here in Miami who are going through the same experience. But it's not just somebody. Sometimes people think it's a tenant. It's not. They don't own the place. It's not their home. They should move. Well, it really, somebody's home is their home, whether they own the property or whether it's where they live with their families. And when somebody is displaced, they lose their homes. Children have to lose school. If they're forcibly evicted, they may lose possessions. Having that eviction record can make it difficult to find future housing. that instability of having to take time off work and look for a new place and then move your stuff and just deal with the problem can lead to job loss if they're missing time at work or losing income from the time they have to take off. It's stressful. The financial costs of moving, storage, deposits, all that adds up. And the theory of Matthew Desmond's book is really that, eviction isn't something that happens to people who are in poverty. It's something that traps people in these economic circumstances because of all the costs that come with eviction. You layer that on now, of course, everyone knows we're in the pandemic. I'm sure this audience really knows the economic impact that we've faced here in Florida because of COVID. But the statistic I think is really important is that 28% of Florida households right now are saying they expect that they may have an eviction or foreclosure notice in the next 2 months, which is a huge number, as well as the $57 billion in rent that is owed nationwide. So, it's not just an economic crisis. We also have a public health crisis. How do you protect yourself if you don't have a home? How do you social distance? Eviction leads to, if you get evicted and you don't have anywhere to go, you're either going to stay with friends and family, so you're doubling up, crowding more people into the same place. You may end up in a shelter, which obviously those are having issues with social distancing. And I left a word off there. That's PowerPoint, but you're less likely to take health precautions to take care of your health. I mean, if you have to, live in your car, you're less likely to be sort of in a safe environment. And the studies studying states that have lifted their eviction moratoriums, they've shown that their rates of infection and death are increased when eviction moratoriums have been lifted over the past year. This woman who's in this photograph here, you may have seen her in the news for those of you who are from South Florida, Miami area. She was a woman who was evicted while we were in a state of emergency. Year before last, when Hurricane Dorian was approaching. Everyone else was, packing up their homes, protecting their environment. The storm was supposed to be hitting within 24 hours, and this poor woman was evicted with all of her belongings put out in the street as a hurricane was approaching. So when we're in states of emergency, it's an issue. There's always been a racial disparity to housing in this country. And of course, pre-pandemic, the evidence showed that Black renters are evicted at higher rates than their statistical share of the population, of the renters population. And of course, that's gonna be exacerbated during the pandemic crisis. You'll see that the housing instability is significantly higher in both the Black and Hispanic populations. So I want to lay the framework for evictions in Florida so that I can then explain sort of how the pandemic protections come in. So what are the types of evictions? There are generally sort of 4 different reasons why somebody might be evicted. The most common one is non-payment of rent. And of course, in the pandemic, that's really what a lot of the evictions are based upon. People lost jobs, lost income, they can't afford the rent. There are situations where there are other lease violations. Feedback from somebody on the line.
Something happened here. Let me see if I can reach out and get us.
That was a different time, a different commission. The most recent commission.
Hold on just a minute, Jeff.
The one I take great
looks like it's Chris Norwood.
Centennial.
Let's see if we can get.
Each of us had 2, and the president had 2. So it was 6 to 4. It isn't unusual to give the president, and we don't talk about Democrats and Republicans. These could be independents. They could all be one. I hesitated to put in there that there should be a difference only of one because
Uh,
maybe more independence would be.
I know how to.
We don't know.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to see what's happening, Jeff.
I'm gonna leave the room and then see if I can get a tech person to come help us out.
I'm gonna tell Quinn out to help us.
If you don't have your purpose as to what the purpose of this is, then the rest of it is not the important part of the conversation. Yes, sir.
Help me, Sandra.
Okay, well, it's a little quieter now. I'll keep going.
Please keep going and up to
Yeah.
text. Thank you.
So what are the types of evictions? So like I said, non-payment is the most common. You know, there are other situations where the landlord is saying that the tenant has violated some other provision of the lease. You know, common things are, you know, people staying with them they aren't supposed to, pets that aren't allowed them to, you know, any other type of violation. The probably second most common type of eviction is when when many of our clients in the low-income communities don't have leases. They're just paying each month. And under Florida law, that's called a month-to-month tenancy. That means the tenant just has a right to be there for a month. And the landlord can really terminate for any reason, as long as it's not an illegal reason like discrimination or retaliation. And then there's times when the lease is coming up to the end, and what's going to happen there. You know, some landlords file evictions there, and this type of eviction is getting more common in the COVID world, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So if a landlord decides they want to bring an eviction, they want possession back of their property, first thing they have to do is they have to send a notice to the tenant. For a non-payment case, the landlord has to send a 3-day notice saying, here's how much you owe me, pay it within 3 business days, or move out. Landlord has to do that first. If it's another type of eviction, for another type of lease violation, the landlord has 2 options. They have to give the tenant 7 days notice, but it's either going to be a notice to, if it's a really serious lease violation, some sort of, let's say, damage to the property, sort of maybe a assault on a neighbor or something really serious, then the landlord can just say, get out within 7 days. But for most lease violations, a tenant should be given an opportunity to fix it. They should be given at least 7 days to fix that violation. And then if it happens again, then the landlord could file an eviction if it happens again in the next 12 months. For those people who don't have leases, the landlord's just saying, hey, you know what, I want you out. I want the property back. In Florida, we have one of the shortest periods in the entire country. Florida law says a landlord only has to give a tenant 15 days notice. And you know, imagine moving your family, packing up your belongings, and trying to find a new place to live, all within 15 days. Virtually impossible. We are very lucky in Miami-Dade County. As of beginning of February, countywide, landlords must give at least 30 days notice before the end of the month to terminate a tenancy without cause. So that gives families, you know, much more time to find housing, make alternative arrangements. It's a much more reasonable amount of time. It used to only be in Miami Beach in the city of Miami, but we're, you know, as I said, as of February 1st, 30 days required. At the end of the lease, what happens? The landlord still needs to give a notice telling the tenant, you know what, I'm not renewing your lease, time to get out. But sometimes leases can provide for different time frames. So it's really important to look to see what the lease says if it addresses what to do when a lease expires. And then of course, you know, all these rules I'm telling you, they come from what the law says, but the lease can actually expand those time frames. So the landlord can, if by agreement the parties say, I'm going to give 30 days notice for anything, then that's what would control. But a lease can't take away any of these time frames. So this is just an example of what a notice might look like. This is the 3-day notice. It's actually language that the Florida legislature has sort of set up. Basically says, you owe me this amount, pay within 3 days. Now this is a bad notice because the landlord didn't actually give the right amount of time, but that's the form notice. So the landlord gives that notice. If the tenant's still living in the property, then the landlord can go and file an eviction lawsuit in court. It is a lawsuit. They're suing the tenant, asking for possession of the property. If it's about non-payment of rent, just suing for eviction doesn't mean that the landlord is going to recover that money, because all they're asking for is for possession of the property. If the landlord wants to sue and get a money judgment against the tenant, they have to bring a second claim as part of the lawsuit. And the rules are slightly different when a landlord does that. A lot of landlords in Florida just focus on getting possession back and actually don't sue for that money judgment. Once the landlord files that lawsuit, the tenant is going to receive a copy of it through a summons. They'll either get it handed to them by a process server or the sheriff, or if after 2 attempts, the process server can put it on the door of the property. And the clerk usually mails a copy as well. And this is an example, just sort of what the summons looks like here in Miami-Dade County. You'll see there's a lot of words on it. It's in very small print. So it can be very confusing for a tenant who gets this as to what they need to do. It's all there, but I wouldn't say it's written in a way that a lot of people can understand it. And of course, it's they do have a version of it in both Spanish and Haitian Creole. But sometimes that doesn't get served on tenants who don't speak English, which can be confusing. So once the tenant gets that, they have 5 days to file a response with an answer, which really is just saying why they shouldn't be evicted. And they've got 5 days to respond. It's 5 business days, so it's a relatively short period of time, which is pretty simple. I mean, a lot of clients who don't have lawyers, they just write a letter to the court explaining why they shouldn't be evicted. This is an example of what is very sort of typical. This is a tenant who's living in a property where the landlord wasn't making repairs, was explaining about fecal matter coming down the wall into the kitchen, and filed this response with the court. So you might think, well, what's going to happen next? I'm sure the court's going to have a hearing. We're going to figure out, was the landlord doing what they were supposed to be doing? Does the tenant owe rent? I think most people assume that's what happens next. But unfortunately in Florida, it's not. In Florida, we have a very draconian requirement that tenants must deposit their rent, all past due rent, into the court, or else they lose. So they have to either deposit all the rent, and of course, if it's about non-payment, they probably don't have the rent, so they can't do that. If it's a case where, and this does happen occasionally, where the tenant's like, I did pay my rent. They can raise as a defense, I paid the rent. In those cases, the tenant's not required to deposit rent. Or they file what's called a motion to determine rent, saying to the judge, you know what, I dispute the amount of rent that's owed. Here's why I don't believe I have to deposit on what the landlord's saying. Unfortunately, a lot of tenants don't really know to do that, or don't do it clearly enough. The example of that I showed you on the slide before, the tenant actually kind of said that at the bottom. But if it's not clearly written, sometimes the courts don't see it. And unfortunately in Florida, I believe that the statistics is about 70% of answers that are filed are defaulted. So the tenant goes to court thinking they're going to have a defense, but what happens under state law is that if you don't deposit the rent, the tenant waives all defenses. And that means that the tenant loses their case automatically, and the court's going to enter a judgment for possession without a hearing or without going to mediation. Our position is that this violates a tenant's right to due process, right? If you get sued over $50, you're going to have a right to go to court, but we're talking about somebody's home and making them homeless, and you do not have a right to a hearing in Florida, which is a real barrier. Now, one of the questions is, what if the landlord's not making repairs? We have a lot of clients that we represent where, because affordable housing is so difficult to find, They accept housing that has conditions that really aren't livable, where the landlord's not meeting their obligation as a landlord and as operating a business of rental housing. They're not maintaining safe, habitable housing. So one thing we don't have, and sometimes tenants think they can do this, is tenants in Florida aren't allowed to just make the repairs if the landlord won't, and then deduct it from their rent. It's not allowed in Florida. What we have in Florida is something called a rent withholding letter. The tenant can send a notice to the landlord, a letter saying, you need to fix these things in my unit. If you don't fix them within 7 days, I'm going to withhold my rent. And if the landlord doesn't do that, the law says it's a complete defense to an eviction. But, you know, I mean, that means that a tenant has to sort of bring on an eviction in order to raise this or to force a landlord into it. And at this point, if an eviction gets filed, the court may still order the tenant to put money into the court registry. So the tenants are often sort of in this bind. Do I want to continue throwing money towards a property where the landlord won't make repairs? Or do I just want to take the money, take my rent money and use it to relocate somewhere else? The problem with that is that the cycle continues over and over and over again. So if the tenant files a motion to determine rent saying, I dispute the amount of rent that's owed, the court's going to have a hearing on that and probably will order the tenant to deposit something into the court. Once the tenant does that, in a lot of places in Florida, the parties will then go to mediation, where they'll sit down with an independent mediator, try to work something out. You know, if the tenant has a lawyer, there might be some depositions in the case, but you know, you don't see that very often in most evictions where tenants are unrepresented. And then eventually there's going to be a trial. In most cases, it's going to be a judge who's hearing the case to see if the landlord's entitled to the property. Tenants can request a jury trial. We always do that in our office. You know, it may not necessarily be the right thing to do if the tenant doesn't have a lawyer, but you got a right to a jury trial in Florida unless the lease says you waive that right. So what happens on the back end? If the tenant loses for either at trial or because they were defaulted, the court's going to enter a final judgment, which says the landlord's entitled to possession of the property. Then the clerk will issue what's called a writ of possession. Some people call that the 24-hour notice because that gets sent to the sheriff, and then the sheriff comes out and puts it on the door. In Miami, before the pandemic, it would be at least a week usually, unless the landlord paid a lot of money to expedite it. It would usually be at least a week before the police came and put it on the door. Legally, they can come back within 24 hours, and in a lot of places in Florida, you know, the court enters the judgment, the sheriff puts it on the door the same day, and they come back the next day to remove the property, to remove personal belongings from the property. And there's no exceptions for health, weather, children. Only the judge can stop it at that point. In Miami-Dade County, it's a much longer process. We just have more people. So it's usually a 2-week process for all of this to happen, sometimes longer. Okay, so putting this in sort of the, you know, so you hear that process. It's very draconian. It's very fast. It's almost rubber stamping evictions throughout it. And when the pandemic hit, people didn't have the rent, right? That was the issue. So we had sort of a lot of government interventions to try to prevent massive displacement. So the first thing is the governor in Florida had a statewide eviction moratorium that lasted from April through September. That's gone now. It doesn't exist. There's also a moratorium on some properties connected with the Federal CARES Act for March, but that ended in July. So what we're left with now primarily is the CDC eviction moratorium. So this was issued on September 4th, and it's been extended a couple times through March 31st of this year. You know, it's less of an economic, some of the prior protections were really focused on the fact that people didn't have money. The CDC moratorium is really about the public health and keeping people from being displaced and moving throughout the community to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So in order for a tenant to be eligible, They have to sign a declaration. Every adult in the household has to sign it. These are the qualifications for it. It really applies to most people, I would say. There's very few people who don't fall into one of these categories or into all of these categories. So income less than 99,000, 198,000, that's really high. So most households are covered. They're unable to pay the full rent because of a loss of income or extraordinary medical bills. Very importantly, there's no requirement that that loss of income be linked to COVID. So there could be other reasons, you know, maybe you were in an accident and couldn't work anymore. You're still going to be covered under the CDC eligibility, because remember, this isn't about the economics. It's really about making sure people aren't displaced. You have to say that you've made your best efforts to obtain governmental rent assistance. We'll talk about those programs in a few moments, but usually they open for a short period of time, and hopefully the individual has applied. But it's also sort of forward-looking. So most people can, if they haven't done it already, can then start using their best efforts to apply for the rental assistance. They have to say that they're likely to become homeless or forced to live in close quarters in another residence if evicted. So, you know, a lot of people, especially with fewer economic means, they're going to have to move in with friends or family or shelter, or they will become homeless. So this prong is, you know, most people I speak to can attest to this. And then they have to promise to make their best efforts and make timely partial payments as high as they can based upon the individual circumstances. So this is really, you know, it looks at what the individual circumstances are. So if you have somebody who's lost their entire income, you know, their best effort is going to be zero. So most people can do this. So once the tenant signs that declaration and gives it to the landlord, they're protected. The order is very broadly written to what eviction could cover. Unfortunately, in October, the CDC issued some non-binding guidance that says the order doesn't keep landlords from starting the eviction process or suspending court operations. I know that some people think that the current administration might change that, but as of now, that non-binding guidance is still out there, which is a little problematic for those of us representing tenants. Very importantly, it doesn't affect the rent that's owed under the lease. It clearly applies to non-payment evictions. There's certain evictions that are not covered under the CDC moratorium. Basically other types of lease violations, criminal activity, threatening other people. One of the big loopholes or questions, because I'm unwilling to concede that this is the case, but the order does not clearly apply to people whose leases have expired. So if you're talking about somebody who's been out of work since March, you know, the pandemic, we're going on a year, even if they sign that lease in March and it's a one-year lease, we're coming up to the expiration of the lease. So a lot of landlords have been pushing that the protections do not apply to tenants whose leases have expired. But that's not included in the list of evictions that aren't covered. So it's really an unanswered question. And you're going to have probably judges on both sides of that issue. That's another thing that I know advocates at the national level have been pushing, tenant advocates have been pushing to close that loophole. There are penalties for both landlords and tenants. You know, if the tenants don't sign a declaration of bad faith, there's penalties, and landlords can be fined up to $100,000 or even higher for violating the moratorium. In Miami-Dade County only, we have a local, I wouldn't even call it a moratorium, it's a policy that prohibits execution on the writs of possession at that very last stage of the process. So that's been in place since March 12th. The mayor announced that commercial evictions are going to resume on March 5th. And in November, there was a change so that any eviction filed before March 12th, the landlords can proceed with executing on the writs. But for any eviction filed after March 12th of 2020, which is the beginning of the pandemic, the police department is not executing on writs. And that's really been important and critical in keeping people housed. here in Miami. As I mentioned, none of this changes the rent. It remains due and owing, which is the big issue. So the last COVID relief bill, the CARES Act had money for March, and when it was given out over the summer and fall. In December, Congress approved $25 billion nationwide in rental assistance. That money went out in January, and it's starting to, the programs are opening soon. Maybe in some places they've already started to open. For those of you in South Florida, Access Helps is an organization that's doing a great job of trying to pull all those resources together. So you can just look in one place. But I know the county, for example, Miami-Dade County has $60 million that they're going to be giving out and opening their program very soon. And if you're working with tenants who need legal representation, I'll just say that legal representation is really important. It makes a difference. I know I'm a lawyer saying this, so it's a little bit of self-interest in that regard, and not to overstate our importance, but the system isn't designed for people. As I described it, it's designed to sort of to rubber stamp things. And if you have a lawyer, we're more likely to sort of know how to navigate those procedures to try to prevent that from happening. Can't always, because the law is written the way it is, we can't always stop it, but we do our best to at least buy time so that landlords and tenants can get into rental assistance, can figure things out. There's also a great website on here, FloridaEvictionHelp.org, which has will help you fill out the CDC declaration if you need it. It's just a form, so it's not too hard to fill out, but and we'll also walk a tenant through sort of like how to fill out an answer and ask questions, and generate an answer that can be filed in court. So I just like to leave people when I talk about evictions is to say, take this quote from Justice Thurgood Marshall in a case saying that our courts weren't intended to serve as rubber stamps for landlords, but to see justice is done before a man's evicted from his home. And it's my position that that is not the case in Florida. The way the law is written, the courts really are rubber stamps, and it's a real problem. So I think it's a good segue to turn it over to Santra to talk about sort of what's happening on the ground and how these laws and policies actually impact people.
Sounds good. Go ahead, Sandra. And put your questions in, please.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to share my screen. Here we go. So again, I'm super excited to be here and to share a little bit about the work that is happening at Miami Worker Center that actually really predates me. And so I'll really just get into it. Miami Worker Center is an action and strategy center, and we do our work at the intersection of gender, race, and socioeconomic status. A little bit of the history in terms of housing. Miami Worker Center is primarily known for our housing work. We also do labor and organize with care workers, primarily home health aides, CNAs, house cleaners, and nannies. And so that's really where you're seeing a bulk of our work. It's really labor and then housing. And the folks who are the most vulnerable are low-wage workers. And so it just makes sense to really do work at that intersection. We continue to build a movement for housing justice and renter power in Miami. So just like straight facts, and maybe Jeff can also fact check me, but 68% of the people who live in Miami are renters. So more than half of our folks are renters in Miami. And it's important for us to understand that because we are in a pandemic where actually, let me go to the next slide, where we already know Miami is the most rent burdened city in America. And so I'll take, for example, the population that we're working with, care workers, people who also might be employed in the hospitality industry. Many of those folks have completely stopped working. They haven't worked since March 2020, and there hasn't been a way for them to find other work. Many of them are mixed status family, meaning that they did not receive any assistance from the government in terms of the first stimulus package that went out. I'm sorry, it's not stimulus, but the first checks that we received from the government, and they did not receive it. No one in their family received it, neither, even if they had children that were American citizens, if they were undocumented or had mixed status families, they didn't receive any help. And so for those folks, we know that one, it was already costly to live in Miami. And now with this pandemic, we're really starting to see it come to a head and really bubble up in terms of the issues that Miami renters have been experiencing, not just this year or last year, but for a long time here in our county and in our state. So really quickly, evictions in Florida and Miami, over 9,200 evictions have been filed in Miami-Dade County since March of 2020. Florida has an estimated 15.6% of renters at risk of being evicted. And when we hear these numbers, we have to ask ourselves, where will these people go? Right? Black and Latinx people represent 80% of people who face eviction, according to a report by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so you're already starting to see the disparities that exist. One, we already know there's more than half of us who are renters. We also know that there are about 9,000 evictions that are already in the courthouse. We know that 15.6% of renters are at risk of being evicted. We already know also that there's always been a crisis in terms of affordable housing in our county. So no, there's not anywhere for them to go. And also, if you need first, last, and a security deposit, we know that they don't have that as well. There's no way, and this is a conversation we have all the time at the Miami Worker Center, is that maybe folks can start from day one, but to make up what they've lost, we don't know how they do that. We don't believe that they live in they're employed in a sector that allows them to do that. And so even having first, last, and security deposit will be quite a challenge for many of them. So when we talk about housing justice, we're really talking about that no matter who you are, what you look like, how much money you have, you and your family deserve to live in a safe and affordable home. We don't believe that housing is something that only the wealthy deserve, that they have a right to it. We believe that everyone has a right to have a safe home to live in. And we want to make sure that the policies that are in place allow for us to have that each person that lives in the richest country in the world, that they have that ability to do that. So some of the things that are coming up from our folks, people have been home, they're social distancing. So you can imagine their utility bills are high, light bill, water bill, some abusive landlords are happening, some harassment because folks can't pay, although we have a moratorium at the local level from Miami-Dade County, but as well as through the federal government right now. There isn't as transparency, so folks can get really intimidated by the process that Jeff so amazingly walked us through. But for folks who are maybe not in our chairs, it's quite difficult for them to truly understand how the eviction process works. There's a lot of code violations. So many of the evictions that we're also seeing from some of the corporate landlords, they're also folks who also violate codes, like people have rats, mildew, mold in their home. And I don't believe that anyone in Miami-Dade County should have to live, and no one in this country, no one in this world should have to live in those conditions. Not knowing what the laws are, overlooked disabled tenants, tenant forced to pay penalties, raising rent very rapidly, rent debt, and convoluted process, lack of legal support. There are amazing partners that we work with, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Legal Services of Greater Miami, there's Community Justice Project, but there are not enough attorneys. They don't have enough staff to really cover when there isn't a pandemic, but right now during this crisis, for sure, there is not enough folks in their sector knowing the the legal aspects of tenants. There's not enough folks to really cover all of Miami-Dade County. And so some of the things that we've been advocating for is to expunge and seal eviction records, to make sure that we know that during this critical time, during this crucial time, that if folks have taken a loss, if they've really gotten behind, it's not their fault, and that shouldn't be held against them. For accountability, fair tenant mediation, to make sure that people can meet and for both sides of the story can be told, rent control for sure, and then just cause eviction. And these are some of the policies that we've been advocating for, and that we're making sure that we bring our tenants into the fold and help them understand what their rights are and what they can work to get to in this county and in this state. Really quickly, some of the things that come up a lot is whether or not undocumented folks have rights, tenant rights, whether if you have a written lease or don't have a written lease, do you have rights as well? And for sure, I'm not the attorney, but I definitely wanted to lift that up for folks who are working with a constituency who have mixed status, or for folks who may not rent in the traditional way. We know in Miami-Dade County, people rent rooms, they rent efficiencies that are part of single family houses, or even when folks have an apartment. We also know that people rent rooms there. And so there's a lot of informal leases and a lot of informal living arrangements that we want folks to also know that they are covered as well. Really quickly on this slide, only a judge can order tenants out. We have to always name that because people believe that their tenants can change the locks on them. Their landlords could change the locks on them. They believe the landlord can turn the utilities off on them. And a lot of folks are experiencing that right now. And so we have to reinforce, and we'll ask you partners, folks who are working with the community, to also make sure that people are aware of what their tenant rights are in Florida as well. We're currently still under a moratorium through the end of March. And this county, Mayor Cava, is not enforcing evictions that were filed after March 12, 2020. There is a narrative around squatters, right? That people are saying that these are not people who want to pay. These are people who are just living there and, you know, being not necessarily experiencing COVID laws. And our story is quite different from that. We know that these are workers. We know these are people who may have had informal leases, but really need protections right now. And so we're wanting to make sure that we lift up that narrative, and that a lot of them, you know, that we have worked with. We've been doing a survey amongst the people that we've been knocking on their doors. Many of them are single mothers. And so we're not only talking about individuals at risk for evictions, we're talking about entire families. And again, there's nowhere in Miami-Dade County for these folks to go. We need more protections for tenants in Miami. Millions of dollars have gone to landlords to help cover some of the costs of unpaid rent. And we see many filing evictions against people in Miami. And so some of the folks who have received dollars from the federal government to ensure that folks who are impacted by COVID can stay in their homes right now, we still see that some of them are going to the courts to file evictions for the same people that we're trying to keep them in their homes. And so we want to make sure, this is why we're organizing. This is why Miami Worker Center have been knocking on folks' doors since October, safely, of course, but we know that with the populations that we're working with, that door to door, we consider ourselves essential workers as well. And so we've been knocking on doors, making sure folks understand that we're still under a moratorium, to make sure that they've been impacted and have lost wages, that they have that documentation and that they can file it with their landlord, to make sure that they understand everything that is available to them, and to connect them to resources that are available in the community. So we think renter power is the solution. You know, we, again, are knocking on doors, making sure that tenants know that they're not facing this alone, that many folks are in the same situation that they're in, and that they're stronger together, and they can take collective action. We also know that there needs to be real enforcement. And so we've been having conversations with county government about what this enforcement could look like when there is abuse, when there's retaliation for folks who are speaking out against their landlords, as well as against the conditions that they're living in. And for sure, as progressive as we would get around rent control and to relieve some of the experiences that tenants are experiencing. I believe that is the last slide that I have. And I can pause. I know we're at the halfway mark. I can pause for questions so that we can get Jeff right before he goes.
Well, you know, what Jeff might be able to do is answer some of your questions about those informal leases. I thought that was interesting. someone who's not a citizen or someone who's an informal lease, how does that cover, Jeff? What happens?
Sandra's right. It's that there's no difference. It doesn't matter if your immigration status plays no difference if whether you're a tenant or not. If you're a tenant and you had an agreement to rent a dwelling unit, then you're covered. And if that dwelling unit's a room, if it's you know, an entire apartment, it's treated the same, and the landlord has to go through. All the laws around landlord-tenant relationships apply, and the landlord has to go through an eviction process to force you out. One of the things that Sandra mentioned about landlords who are very frustrated by the moratoriums and are doing things that are illegal, like turning off electricity and changing locks and doing just, you know, awful things. Florida law is actually real. This is one area where we have some actually pretty good protections. The law says that the landlord can't do that. If they do that, they owe the tenant 3 times the monthly rent. And the landlord and the tenant can go to court and get an injunction, an order from the court, telling the landlord to restore the power, to, you know, change the locks back and put the person back in possession. So there's real serious remedies, real serious consequences if the landlord does that.
How strong is a verbal lease, or is that difficult to prove?
I mean, it's an agreement. I mean, it depends on for what purpose, right? You know, if you're talking about, you had an oral agreement, let's just say, to rent a place for $1,000 a month, and the landlord, the tenant stops paying, the landlord goes to court and says, you know, I'm evicting you for not paying the rent. And the landlord and the tenant says, oh no, the rent was $900. Well, yeah, you're going to have to go to a hearing and the judge is going to make a decision. You know, you might have rent receipts to be able to prove what it is. But I guess it just depends. For purposes of, you know, am I protected by the laws because I have an oral lease? It doesn't matter. It's still a rental agreement.
Do you see judgments coming for those tenants that are placed out at the end of March? Do you see landlords filing judgments and a bigger cycle with credit issues coming down? Sandra and Jeff, what do you think?
So 2 things. So some landlords are getting judgments because of rent deposit. And there are, as of last count, I'm sure this number has gone up in the last few weeks, but there are, in Miami-Dade County, there's 1,700 writs of possession that are waiting for the sheriff to execute. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of people put out if we don't get rental assistance in place before the moratorium lifts. How do evictions affect credit is a little more complicated question. There are, so the fact that an eviction is filed is going to show up on the court, what we call the docket, so the website that lists all the cases that were filed. That never goes away. There's actually some legislation that's pending right now in the state legislature to allow for sealing of those records. So we'll have to keep our eyes on what happens in Tallahassee to see if that changes. It's a little unclear whether you can do that right now. Our office actually just got one sealed, but it's not an easy or automatic thing to happen. A lot of the larger management companies, they report, even if they don't sue you for money, they're going to report that to credit reporting agencies, and that's going to cause problems for the tenant. Smaller landlords are less likely to do that. They're probably not going to actually sue, but if they get a judgment against the tenant, that judgment, even though it's for eviction, could show up on the credit report causing problems. So it's a layered sort of response to that, but there's definitely ripple effects that can go out. There's another piece of legislation that would make it unlawful to for a landlord to deny somebody housing because of an eviction during COVID. That's another piece. There's a lot of, there's more pieces of legislation that are pending this year than I've ever seen. I work at a legal services corporation funded organization, so I can't I can't lobby for or against any of these, but there's a lot up there that could impact the law if any of them get traction and start moving.
Sandra, what do you think is going to happen the end of March? You think there'll be an extension? What will happen, in your opinion?
That's such a great question, Patricia. I am hopeful that we will figure it out. I mean, I was just on a call yesterday with the Florida Housing Justice Alliance, and we were talking about the same things, like how do we prepare for post-March? And I mean, without like real assistance, there are going to be a lot of homeless people, houseless people, like we like to call them. And so it's not only back rent, it's also if you do pay the back rent and you still get evicted, you need first, last, and security deposit. You need that assistance. And there's all these fines and fees that happens in terms of reconnection of utilities from one place to another. And so you just, that stuff starts to add up for folks who are really just trying to come back into or going back into the workplace. We are in a more, we're more in a crisis than it feels like. I think that the environment has felt pretty, oh, whoop-de-doo, everything is fine, versus actually, we have to figure this out for Miami-Dade County. We're not just talking about adults. We're talking about entire families not having a place to go while we're trying to social distance, right? And so I was on another meeting and I was talking about who even has a privilege to social distance right now, right? And so there are folks who we think maybe four-person family, when there are folks who have aunts, uncles, all living in one home together. And that is a lot of folks. So it's not your average 4 or 5. There's intergenerational things happening. So you have grandmas, aunts, uncles, and families who are living together. And that really increases the numbers as we think about how many folks will perhaps be on the streets if we don't figure out a real plan to keep people in their homes post-March. I mean, the moratorium won't last forever. We get that. We're really trying to push that as long as we're in this pandemic, people are safe. We also know that, we live in a capitalist society. And so, I don't know, I'm super nervous. It keeps me up at night. That's all I can share.
And I'm going to have to jump off in like 2 minutes, but yeah, I think it's a lot worse, like Santra's saying, than what we know, because there are a lot of landlords who have not filed evictions just because they realize it's a waste of time and money and energy because of the moratoriums. So there are, even though we talked about these 1,700 writs that are out there, there's a whole bunch other of evictions that are just sitting there. And then we have all the ones that we can't even count because the landlords haven't done anything. And it's, when you think about what that could mean, it is really scary. I am hopeful that whatever gets passed at the national level will probably extend the CDC moratorium for a while, which will provide, obviously it has loopholes, it has some problems with it, but it would provide some additional protection for at least some period of time. So you just sort of have to watch what happens in DC as well.
Well, Jeff, we really appreciate you joining us today from the Legal Services of Greater Miami and giving us those insights that you gave us. Now we'll continue with Santra to give us what we can do on the ground to help out with that legislation.
Really important.
Thank you so much.
Thank
we appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye.
I mean, what I will add, Patricia, just to your point, I think that we are telling our folks to continue to call their county commissioners, to call their municipal leaders, to ask for support, to remind them that they are, they live in those districts. What a time to lead and to be responsible for folks. And we're asking people to, take their responsibility as elected officials who can make these decisions seriously. And so continue to keep the pressure on the county commission to keep that moratorium in place so that people are not evicted during this crisis. We do have a progressive mayor, and I think under the leadership of the previous mayor was when the moratorium, the local ordinance was passed, and we're still under that, but I know there's a lot of pressure on the mayor's office right now to start to allow the sheriff's office to enforce these evictions. And I know, I just think that they need to hear more from the constituents that we know, the folks that have lived experience, who are working folks, who might not be working just because their industry is down now. But this narrative around people just don't want to pay their bills is just untrue. Many folks, especially in South Florida, anyone who I know who's working in the hospitality industry, major cuts. And so we have to just be mindful of that.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult situation. I'll throw that out. Does anyone have any questions for Santra? I think it's, I don't know what we're going to do. It's really going to be quite, right now we're assisting with rental payments for some clients in Hillsborough County. We're working under that grant, but it's just, we just have no idea. And you feel the pain all the time with families and children and what's going to happen. And they're carrying that burden every day when you go to bed. It's just a very sad thing to think of. So do we have any other questions right now? What's going to happen with the eviction process? What can we do? And I think the commissioners and the political, getting involved with that is really a very good answer, because we've got to somehow stay it off. Sandra, let me ask you, when Dade County, Miami-Dade County provided funding for landlords, did the tenants have to apply for that for their landlord?
It's actually an agreement with the landlord, and the landlord has to agree to be a part of it. So you wouldn't imagine how many folks don't want to be a part of the program. Like, some landlords won't agree to be a part of the program. Some of them may want other new tenants that they can charge higher rent at this point. And so to answer your question, the program is with the landlord. Tenants for sure benefit from it, but it's not the tenant that's actually applying, it's the landlord.
Is there more funding still available under that right now in the county?
Yes, they're prioritizing folks who have final eviction notices right now, but it's also open to folks who have not, who need assistance, who haven't been able to pay their rent.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Quiet bunch here.
I'm looking in the chat box and I don't have any questions right now on eviction, but I think it's probably because we don't have any answers. We don't know what to ask, and we don't know where to go with this, because we can just imagine what's going to happen the end of March unless it's extended with families all over the state of Florida. I mean, it's just a tremendous crisis. And like you said, we don't feel the impact today, but we're going to see it and feel it, and it's going to be heartbreaking to all of us. So what we can do, let's see, I think I have a question here.
I can say one more thing, Patricia. I think that it's important for us to not only, we're talking about our local elected official, but also at the state. Jeff mentioned we've been following some of the progressive bills as it relates to housing to make sure that people's credit is safe, that if they do happen to get evicted, that there can be expunging of that record. These are things that our elected officials have to hear from us about. They have to hear that we're in support of this, because if we're not the ones saying to them in the large numbers that we have, because listen, we don't have the money to beat out the lobbyists, right? We don't have enough capital to make them move in that way, but we have people power. And so we're asking people to call their elected officials. Session starts on Tuesday in the state of Florida. Call your elected officials, get the constituency groups that you're affiliated with to call, to continue to call, email, text them, not only the folks in the local, but also in your state, also in your city. Everyone needs to understand and be clear that we all see what's coming in March, and we all are concerned, and they have the decision-making ability. And so we're counting on them, and we're expecting them to do right by our neighbors, by our families, and by folks who don't belong on the streets, right? Everyone in our country, everyone in this world deserves to have a place to live. And who has who has the ability to make those decisions and make things happen? It's those folks that we've elected into power. And so we're counting on them to take care of us during this crisis. I think that's their role, right? And I think it's important even right now for us to think about that.
Well, here's the question that came up, and this is going to be, I think, a difficult one to answer. From the people you serve, where are they going when they're evicted?
Good question. Many of them are going to maybe friends and families' homes. I had one of our members move in with her son, who was in Tampa. But if I can kind of like channel my mom, it is really hard for adults to live together. And so it's easy for a relative to tell you, come spend a week, 2 weeks. They may not have enough space, right? People are already living in tight situations already. But the more people you add, the more conflict can come up. And so we just know that families are in a crisis. Temperature is already high, like stress is high. And so people are adding more people to homes. And so a 2-bedroom that used to have 5 people now may have 7, 10. You might have people sleeping on couches, on floors, all throughout homes. That's what we know has been happening. So people are moving in with each other and trying to make it work, but it's not in an environment specifically during the pandemic that we want people in.
And it's going to do so much damage to self-esteem for the individual, the children, just the way you feel about yourself, I think. I just see such large problems. There was a question, can the funding be used to help people secure other housing after evicted in cases where the landlord does not agree to be part of the rental assistance? Have they looked at where there's a refusal and to help those people with a certain program?
I haven't seen that program yet. I may be unaware, but to my understanding, no. I do think that's a great idea. And I think that it is again, all these innovative ideas around how we can assist. I think we also need to be saying, here's another example, county commissioners, state officials, on what we think should be happening in our local areas around housing. So I think helping the landlords is great. Also, if folks do happen to get evicted, one, it shouldn't be on their record, right? But 2, they should get assistance. Like we just know, if you are a hotel worker, if you are a home health aide who have lost your client and out of work, how do you make up that money?
You shouldn't get a judgment either, because you'll never overcome that. It's going to follow you in the history of your credit. Whether you seal the eviction but allow a judgment for the dollars, that's going to be the same thing. It'll just grow. It's a very difficult situation, I think.
Absolutely.
I think that the only thing we can do is reach out. Like you said, the community, the leaders in our community, we've elected to take care of the people.
Absolutely.
Monty, as another board member, what do you think? I'm going to click Monty. Can you hear me? As another board member, tell us what you think about
Yes,
this.
yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't find mute fast enough. Yes, I agree. Children's Services Council and here in Broward, we've also very concerned about this situation and are in the process as we speak of committing $500,000 through United Way to work with, oh gosh, and I'm going to mess it up. I forgot. I know it's 3 agencies, something about the working poor. I'm sorry, I forgot. You did put me on the spot a little bit.
I'm
But
sorry.
anyways, we're going to be committing $500,000 with possibly more if they need it to help to pay some of these rent, because the whole idea, someone said in one of the sessions, the 2 sessions this morning, is we don't want people to lose their house. We want to try to help them before it gets to, Center for Working Families. Thank you, Andrea. I know she's in charge of that contract. Oh, I love my folks. So we want to try to help people before it gets to that stage where they're actually evicted, and to, as you said, I could never live with my mother, nor would I want my daughter to live with me. Love her, but.
Right. Right. So that's great. The Center for Working Families program through the United Way. And you'll be administering that program, I think I read.
Yes.
So
United Way, we're funding it. The United Way will be administering it.
Right.
That's a great point. I just also want to lift up so many of the local nonprofit organizations who have just gone above and beyond to really meet the needs right now. They may not have all the funding that they need, but they've really stood in the gap to help folks pay their utilities. People are home, so utilities will go up, right? People used to be away at work all day, and now they're at home all day. Kids are working from home. Going to school from home. And so groceries have gone up. Utilities, water bill, all of that stuff have gone up. People have had to increase their internet speed because everyone's virtual at home.
Right. The internet is a big issue. If the children don't have the high-speed internet, they're not able to do their academic studies.
Exactly. And so so many of the expenses have gone up while people have not been employed. And so many of the local organizations in Miami-Dade County have really stepped up and really made sure that they provide mutual aids, funding to help support people, although it's just one time. But it really goes far because people wouldn't have had it to begin with. And so really want to thank, there's also the government response, but also for sure the safety net, the nonprofits are also rising to the occasion as well.
That's good. That's very good.